Tonight at 10, the polls have closed in England, Wales and Scotland in local, regional and parliamentary elections. In Scotland, the results for the Scottish Parliament could have an impact on the future of the UK. In Wales, Labour are hoping to extend their 22 years in office since power was devolved to Cardiff Bay. In England's local elections, the biggest for decades, the Conservatives face a struggle in London, but they're hopeful of gains elsewhere. We'll be looking at what's at stake in this very big test of public opinion. Also tonight, more tensions off the coast of Jersey as French fishermen protest against the new rules brought in after Brexit.
If the arrangement doesn't go back to normal, we're not going to be able to survive.
Reporting undercover as we reveal the full scale of the COVID crisis overwhelming hospitals in India.
Is announced.
Very good evening from the BBC election studio, because polling stations have just closed after a day of voting in England, Scotland and Wales, and the biggest test of opinion since the general election of 2019. Some of today's contests should have taken place last year, but they were delayed because of the pandemic. And the results will be closely watched, not only for the state of the parties and their leaders, but also for the potential impact on the future of the United Kingdom. Now, in Scotland, voters have been electing a new Scottish Parliament with 129 members. And in Wales, they are electing a new Senedd, or Welsh Parliament, with 60 members. In England, votes have been cast for 13 city and regional mayors, thousands of seats on 143 councils and 25 members of the London Assembly. There are 39 police and crime commissioners being elected throughout England and Wales. And in addition to all of that, there's also been a parliamentary by-election in Hartlepool where Labour is fighting to hold on to the seat. And the only part of the UK without any elections is Northern Ireland. Well, we'll be asking what's at stake in all of these contests. But first, this report by our political correspondent, Ben Wright.
For all party leaders, these elections are a test. For Boris Johnson, who voted in London this morning, they're one measure of how voters rate his handling of COVID, which halted last year's poll and still shapes this. For Labour's leader Sir Keir Starmer, these elections are a chance to prove he's taken the party forward since its general election drubbing. And for Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon, the parliamentary elections there are the SNP's big chance to push for another independence referendum. Voters heading to the polls in the Scottish Highlands had to contend with a reappearance of winter, while in Brighton it felt like spring. England has had a bumper crop of elections today after several were postponed because of the pandemic. More than 4,500 council seats have been contested. In London, Labour's Sadiq Khan is seeking a second term as mayor, one of 13 city and regional mayoralties up for grabs. They will tell us a lot about the political drift of England, with the Tories hoping to hold on to the West Midlands, Labour eyeing up West Yorkshire. There are important national elections in Wales, where voters are electing all 60 members of the Senedd, with Labour chasing another 4 years in power. And then there's Hartlepool in the northeast of England, a parliamentary by-election in a seat held by Labour since it was created in 1974. Once the party's heartlands, the result will test the pulse of Labour's vote in an area that saw a surge in Conservative support at the 2019 general election. The result in Hartlepool certainly has the potential to reverberate at Westminster. Holding the seat would be a relief for Labour. Winning it would be a triumph for the Tories. But in the end, it's only a by-election. Whereas if the SNP wins a majority in the Scottish Parliament, then Nicola Sturgeon will push for another referendum on Scottish independence, a referendum Boris Johnson has said he will resist. It's been an election day unlike any other, with COVID-secure polling stations and voters advised to bring their own pencils. The pandemic has shown how power is dispersed around the UK, and the result of these elections could put a new question mark over the union's political future. Ben Wright, BBC News, Westminster.
So to pick up on Ben's last point there, for many observers, the elections to the Scottish Parliament are possibly the most significant because of their potential to affect the future of the United Kingdom. The Scottish National Party is hoping to gain an overall majority of the 129 seats being contested, raising the prospect that the party leader, Nicola Sturgeon, would then declare that she had a mandate for demanding a referendum on independence. Our Scotland editor, Sarah Smith, has more details.
Your first vote is a rite of passage that arrives aged 16 in Scotland.
How was it, Lulu?
Good. In Edinburgh, Lulu cast her ballot on the way to school. The Scottish Tory leader Douglas Ross MP hopes his vote will get him another job as a member of the Scottish Parliament, along with his seat in Westminster. Labour leader Anas Sarwar is standing against Nicola Sturgeon in Glasgow Southside. He's not expecting to beat her in that constituency, or to overtake the SNP as the largest party in Holyrood.
Make sure you vote COVID safe and make it both votes Labour.
Both votes because there's two ballot papers, one to elect a constituency MSP and one for the regional list vote, which is used to elect members on a proportional basis. Snow, in May, across much of Scotland, doesn't appear to have deterred too many voters. And of course, there are dogs at polling stations. On Twitter, and in real life, which can pose a hazard for some.
I'm a bit scared of dogs.
Opinion polls suggest Nicola Sturgeon should be pretty confident she will continue as First Minister. The big question is whether the SNP can secure an overall majority and claim a mandate for a referendum on Scottish independence. Former First Minister Alex Salmond is attempting a comeback with his new party, Alapa. Will they win any seats at all? On golf courses, as well as in schools and community halls, the decisions voters have made today could take Scotland one step closer to a vote on leaving the United Kingdom. Now, we hope to get the results of most, if not all, of the 73 constituency seats at some point tomorrow. We probably won't get the results of the 56 regional list seats until sometime on Saturday, if indeed might go into Sunday. So by this time tomorrow night, we might well know how the SNP are performing, because they tend to do best in those constituency seats. So it could be that this time tomorrow we'll be able to tell you whether or not they look as though they are on course to reach that magic number of 65 seats.
Sarah, we'll talk again tomorrow, of course. Thanks very much for now. Sarah Smith, our Scotland editor there. Well then, in Wales, where Labour has been in power since the advent of devolved government back in 1999, the First Minister, Mark Drakeford, is fighting off challenges from the Conservatives in Labour's old traditional heartlands, in the northeast of Wales, for example, while Plaid Cymru is hoping to secure enough seats in the Senedd to make them the main opposition. And the handling of the pandemic has shed more light than ever on the different powers and policies enabled by devolution. So let's join our Wales correspondent, Huw Griffith, in Cardiff. What's at stake, Huw?
Well, Huw, arguably the question in any Welsh election isn't if Labour can hold on to power, but how will they go about it this time? 22 years in power, but never an overall majority of the 60 seats in the Senedd. Behind me, last time around, they took 29 seats. I think the expectation within the party is that numbers will go down a few, but hopefully they say they've managed to avoid going down to the low 20s. Of course, it means they'll have to strike a deal of some sort with the other parties. What about those other parties? Well, in the race for second place, I think the Welsh Conservatives feeling pretty buoyed, pretty confident about some of those Labour-held seats in North East Wales. For Plaid Cymru, arguably harder for them to break through during the pandemic because a lot of their arguments have been pretty similar to Labour. However, their leader, Adam Price, may yet be in a position of power. Now, he's ruled out being a junior partner in coalition with Labour, but he's not ruled out doing some kind of deal. And so potentially he and Mark Drakeford could be on the phone to each other over the next couple of days. The counting doesn't start until tomorrow. We'll have a result, hopefully, by this time tomorrow night.
OK, Howell, thank you very much once again. Howell Griffith there with thoughts on the Welsh situation there in Cardiff. Well, today's parliamentary by-election in Hartlepool in County Durham is being seen as an important test for Labour and its leader, Sir Keir Starmer, to see if the party has made any progress in regaining ground in its former strongholds in the northeast of England. Hartlepool was held by Labour in 2019, while the Conservatives gained several seats in that same region. Our political correspondent, Alex Forsyth, is in Hartlepool with the latest thoughts there tonight. Alex?
Yeah, well, Huw, this is where the votes will be counted, and if the sheer number of politicians and journalists that have descended on the town in the last few days and weeks are anything to go by, it is a sign of what's at stake. And there are nerves about the outcome tonight because, of course, this is a test for the Conservatives of whether the support that they won at the general election in 2019 was a one-off, something driven by Brexit, or if it's something they can sustain. Of course, for Labour, if they lose here, a seat they've held for decades, that would be very significant. Difficult questions for Sir Keir Starmer, a man who's promised to revive the party's fortunes, but also deeper questions about the party's general direction. And for the people of Hartlepool, it's about whether the jobs, the investment, the opportunity that's been promised to them by all the parties comes to fruition. Now, across the country, the results are expected to trickle in over the course of the next few days, but here, the ballot boxes are coming in, they'll be counted tonight, the result will come in the morning, an early indication of the mood of the public and an indication of whether those traditional party ties are still holding or whether they're continuing to fray.
OK, Alex, thanks very much. And again, more from you tomorrow as well. Alex Forsyth there in Hartlepool, where the by-election's taking place. So it's a bumper crop of results. We're just underlining that fact. And over the weekend, we'll be here to look at the results, and Rita will be with me. So let's have a guide to the early ones, Rita.
Well, Huw, there are 7 different sets of elections taking place across Britain. Particularly significant, as we've already said, are the ones in Scotland and in Wales. But some of the first results that are likely to come in are from the local elections in England. These are some of the contests we'll be looking at particularly. There'll be exciting contests. Now, these elections were meant to be held last year, but they were postponed because of COVID. They were last fought in 2016, and that's important, and I want to show you why. Now, this graph that's going to come up is going to show you the projected national share. Now, this shows how each of the main parties would have performed in the last 10 years if there'd been a national vote. And this is based on the local election results of each of those years. You can see that the lines are blue for Conservative, red for Labour, orange for Lib Dem, and the grey one is for other parties. Now, I want to focus on 2 years in particular. You can see here in 2016, which is when those councils we looked at were last up, the Conservatives and Labour were virtually neck and neck. So given that the opinion polls now suggest a comfortable Tory lead, we would expect them to pick up votes in those councils. But the next year, in 2017, look at that big gap between the red and the blue. The Tory lead then was higher than opinion polls suggest that it is now, meaning that in councils like these, which were last up in 2017, we would expect to see the Conservatives faring less well. Now, as well as results for those councils starting to come in, there are also contests for mayors that are going on across England. There are 13 contests. These are 8 of them. Some of these were Labour before, some were Tory. The West Yorkshire post is a new post. And just finally to mention, as Alex was reporting from Hartlepool, we are also expecting results from that one Westminster by-election. And I just want to show you the result. Last time round, a Labour majority. This has been a Labour seat since the 1960s, but the Tories think that they're in with a real chance now. Huw.
Rita, much more to come tomorrow, but thanks very much for now. Rita Chakrabarti there. With me is our political editor, Laura Kuensberg. We're always talking about stakes being high, Laura. So let's just spell it out. What are the stakes for Labour and the Conservatives tomorrow?
Well, as Rita was saying, the national polling puts the Conservatives comfortably ahead most of the time, but we can't say enough that this is a really big range of contests, local and national, and there could be all sorts of interesting things lurking in the undergrowth. It's also worth remembering the parties themselves are really flying blind this time. The practicalities of the pandemic mean that they haven't been able to be on the doorstep campaigning in the way that they normally would, so they know much less about what's really been going on. But whether or not it's the Hartlepool by-election or what happens in Wakefield Council, the Tories really hope that they can show they're continuing to dig further and further into territory where they would have been alien a decade ago. And Labour is under real pressure to show that under Keir Starmer, not so new, but first time he's been tested like this nationally, that he has been able to stop some of the rot. Big fundamental questions for both sides.
Well, let's consider even higher stakes. Let's look at Scotland, where lots of people think, that result could shape the future of these islands. How do you read that?
Well, I think that's absolutely the case. Whether or not Nicola Sturgeon can reach that overall majority, that magic number for them of 65 seats, really will shape a very, very important discussion that really could have a seismic impact on what happens to the United Kingdom. Now, we know the Westminster government, Boris Johnson, said time and time again that he would refuse her request, even if she gets that kind of majority. But if the SNP feel that they are able to push ahead with another referendum, then the United Kingdom could be in for another very fraught, very exciting if that's what you want, very unnerving if that's what you don't want. But we could well, as a country, be in for another couple of years of very fraught, very tense constitutional debate. And it could very quickly become Boris Johnson's biggest headache.
Laura, thanks very much once again, and we'll talk tomorrow as well. Laura Kuensberg for us there with some thoughts before the counting starts in lots of places. Those we saw there earlier in Hartlepool and in a few other places, the counting is just about getting underway. We'll have full coverage of all of those results over the next few days here on BBC News, starting with that Hartlepool by-election result expected in the early hours of the morning. And then we'll have in-depth analysis of all the results and a special programme with me here in the election studio, Kirsty Walk, my colleague in Edinburgh. That's from 9 o'clock tomorrow morning on BBC Two and on the BBC News channel. Now, let's turn to some of the day's other news. Around 60 French fishing boats have taken part in a protest outside Jersey's largest port in a dispute over access to the island's waters. 2 Royal Navy vessels were sent to deal with a possible blockade of St Helier, and France responded by dispatching 2 patrol vessels of its own. Under the Brexit trade agreement, only French crews with a history of fishing in the area qualify for a licence. So far, 41 permits under this new system have been granted. But the French say that these licences include restrictions and conditions that have not been mutually agreed. Well, our correspondent Robert Hall reports now from St Helier.
They had left their home ports before dawn, not to fish, but to carry a message to their island neighbours. Many of these vessels have fished here for generations, but Brexit ended the old agreements. They've been replaced with a new licensing system. The French claim the scheme, which came into effect last weekend, was rushed and over-restrictive, putting their livelihoods at risk. This fisherman told me they had no alternative but to reject Jersey's move.
If the arrangement doesn't go back to normal, we're not going to be able to survive. 50%, even more, 80% of French boats will disappear.
The French have said they needed to do something. They made that resolution at the weekend. Here they are. There are boats around me here from fishing villages and towns all around Normandy and further afield as well. They have said that they are going to sit out there in the channel leading to St Helier and await discussions. Beyond the fleet, shrouded in low cloud, visible reassurance from the UK. One of 2 Royal Navy patrol ships underlining support for Jersey's stance. And hidden from view on the edge of Jersey's waters, a French vessel monitored the standoff. 5 hours after they arrived, leaders of the French delegation did get the meeting they'd asked for. Jersey's ministers had been negotiating via Westminster and Brussels. Now they were able to hear grievances face to face.
The information that had been provided somehow had got lost in translation, and what they actually did every day was not transmitted into the bureaucratic process and the information provided. We've got to get to the bottom of that and correct those licences if it's appropriate.
Among the fleet waiting for news at sea, a number of Jersey boats. There are those on the island who have long-standing friendships in Normandy. The licensing row has meant that Jersey's fishermen can no longer land their catches in France. They too want the issue resolved. But others are clear that Jersey's government should not be intimidated by protest or threats.
Jersey needs to stand firm. We need to manage our fish stocks, there's no question about that. We need to manage the resource out there, and Jersey has done nothing wrong.
This evening, French fishermen are back in port and the Royal Navy has been ordered home. The protest had made its point to sympathetic ears, but this row between neighbours is not yet over. Robert Hall, BBC News, Jersey.
Well, let's get the perspective then from across the channel, and let's go to the port of Carteret. And our correspondent there is Jean Mackenzie. Jean, tell us what's going on.
Well, the fishermen arrived back here in port earlier this evening, and they arrived back drenched, exhausted after a 15-hour standoff, but they were in a surprisingly good mood. Now, the talks with the Jersey government, they said, went badly. They said they didn't feel they made any progress at all, but they felt their protest was a success. They got themselves noticed, and really, this was the point. The last few days have been all about drama. We've had talk of a blockade, we've had the French threatening to cut off electricity supplies to Jersey, because there is an awful lot at stake here for these fishermen. Many of them rely on being able to access Jersey's waters. Some of them we spoke to catch more than 50% of their stock along Jersey's shores. So the idea they might not be able to fish there, or they'd only be able to fish there for a limited number of days, or they might not get their permits, is unthinkable. Now the drama has died down. It is really on the EU and it's on the French government to take their fight forward and resolve this.
Jean, once again, many thanks. Jean Mackenzie there, correspondent in Normandy with the latest. Now, the UK is set to record its strongest economic growth since the Second World War. That's the latest forecast from the Bank of England, which now sees the pent-up demand after COVID restrictions are lifted, fueling a boom in activity. Now, the bank has raised its growth forecast to 7.25% this year, up from 5%, which was predicted in February. And it said that the economy is set to return to its pre-pandemic size by the end of the year. The bank expects unemployment to rise slightly to almost 5.5% in the third quarter of this year, when the government's furlough scheme comes to an end. So with interest rates staying at an all-time low of 0.1%, our economics editor Faisal Islam looks at how long the recovery could last and what it could mean for jobs.
A year on, some pandemic clouds are lifting, and after an historic economic fall, an equally historic rebound is now happening, and it's much stronger than expected. All of which can be seen in the Oxford outskirts, in the shops and in the salons.
Hi, Pretty. Hello, how are you? We're growing, so we've got that opportunity of further employment. I have spoken to some clients who have unfortunately been made redundant or lost their jobs, but again, they're optimistic that they will find something and they're looking for something.
That picture seen in the Bank of England's latest forecast of a vaccine-driven, much sharper recovery this year, with over 700,000 furloughed workers now predicted to return straight to their jobs rather than lose them. Right now, the economy is rebounding sharply, and that's the obvious and natural consequence of the vaccine, principally the one invented in this city, rolling out and enabling businesses merely to reopen. But it has another consequence too, which is to instill confidence in consumers to go out and enjoy social activities that have been shut. And that could turn the rebound into a very real recovery. The bank thinks more lockdown savings will now be spent, but the impacts do differ. It's tougher in the centre of Oxford, a place dependent on millions of still absent tourists.
Hi, nice to see you. Cheers.
Jake runs a rooftop bar and nightclub.
The furlough scheme is really helpful, I must say, and we're able to keep on some really key staff, especially managers, which are critical for our business being able to continue. But what's going to play out after June is negotiations with landlords, and it's great that we've kept things afloat, if you like, but there will be a reckoning, and that money will have to be repaid one way or another.
So despite the economy lifting off and house prices surging, the governor remains cautious.
Is it a boom or is it more of a bounce back?
Well, it's more of a bounce back. It's good news, though. But let's put that into perspective. On the basis of our forecast that we've issued today, by the end of this year, output in the economy will be back to where it was at the end of 2019.
And the recovery here and around the nation depends on the continued effectiveness of the vaccination programme, greatly helped by this city's scientists. Faisal Islam, BBC News in Oxford.
Now, India has recorded yet another record rise in coronavirus infections. Officially more than 400,000 new cases, though the actual figure is likely to be much higher than that. Over the past week or so, we've reported on the terrible experience of patients in cities like the capital Delhi. But now the impact of the virus is being felt in the countryside. And with rural hospitals even less well equipped, there are fears of an even bigger crisis to come. Our correspondent, Yogita Lime, has travelled to Uttar Pradesh in the north of the country and sent this report from Varanasi.
In less than an hour, we saw 13 funerals here. The government says there were just 7 in the whole day. And this is Prime Minister Modi's own constituency. The human cost is being suppressed. This is the reality all over India. We'll never know how many died of the virus in this country. India's hinterland is where most of its people live. Amidst lockdowns in big cities, masses are returning to their homes in small towns and villages. The virus is spreading. Rundown hospitals trying to cope with a crisis they've never been equipped for. Conditions the government doesn't want people to see, so we filmed secretly. COVID patients being treated amidst people with other illnesses. The sick being cared for by their own families for a lack of doctors. This is the intensive care unit. We saw toilets overflowing on its floor. Just outside, we met Pankaj Maurya. If she'd got the right medicines and treatment, she might have survived. But she didn't get it here. His wife Rekha was 35. This is the rural health centre she was first taken to. The only one for villages around. Here they didn't discover Rekha had COVID until she became severely ill. There were no resources to treat her.
I've asked each person standing in this queue what they're suffering from. Most of them have told me it's a fever or a cough. And they're waiting in line at a primary health centre. This is the first place that someone from a village would come to. They're waiting here for the doctor who's inside to tell them what's wrong with them.
Most of these people weren't tested for COVID and haven't had the vaccine. We drove miles to reach Rekha's village. Even getting to basic healthcare is out of reach for most here. Her husband Pankaj says their whole family had COVID symptoms. Rekha was the mother of 2 children. People here are angry. The Prime Minister makes announcements on television, but nothing reaches us, a neighbour says. Bimla Devi says there's little we can do. Those who are lucky will survive. Whoever has to die will die. Yogita Lime, BBC News, Uttar Pradesh.
Well, let's have a look at the official figures on coronavirus here in the UK. And they show that there were 2,613 new infections in the latest 24-hour period, meaning an average of 2,044 new cases per day in the past week. 13 deaths were reported in the latest 24-hour period. That's people who died within 28 days of a positive COVID test. And on average in the past week, 12 deaths were announced every day. The total number of UK deaths is now 127,583. Let's have a look at the vaccination progress. Almost 35 million people have had their first dose of a COVID vaccine, and now well over 16 million people are fully vaccinated. A United Nations report is calling for swift action to cut emissions of methane, a greenhouse gas that's second only to carbon dioxide in driving global warming. The report says that curbing methane emissions could deliver immediate and long-lasting benefits for the climate because the gas only lingers in the atmosphere for a relatively short time. Our chief environment correspondent, Justin Rolat, has the story.
You are about to meet methane. The gas that fires your stove seeps from rotting organic material and bubbles from our stomachs and those of cows and sheep. But just look what happens when you add a little bit of pure oxygen.
Methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. Each molecule has 120 times the effect. And the real difference between methane and carbon dioxide is that methane breaks down after about a decade. But carbon dioxide will be with us for thousands of years.
Methane concentrations in the atmosphere have been steadily increasing, but because it breaks down so quickly in the air, the UN says if we can cut emissions, we can rapidly get rid of this powerful warming gas. That means urgently tackling the methane produced by the oil and gas industry, by agriculture, and in our waste.
Methane is second only to carbon dioxide when it comes to driving climate change. And the assessment shows that to put the world on a path that is consistent with the Paris Agreement target of the 1.5 degrees, methane emissions must be reviewed by 45% by 2030.
The report says the fossil fuel industry has the greatest potential to cut methane emissions cheaply by plugging leaks at oil and gas wells and at coal mines, but we can all do our bit to help. We can cut back on red meat and dairy, and if you get a compost collection, do always put your organic waste in it because it's much easier for emissions to be controlled that way.
And technology can help. A new network of high-resolution satellites has been launched that can spot methane emissions, like the methane plume from this rubbish dump in the Indonesian capital, Jakarta. It's spewing methane equivalent to the CO2 from 750,000 cars. And methane is also linked to air pollution that causes tens of thousands of deaths a year worldwide. Yet another reason, says the UN, to start reducing emissions right now. Justin Rolat, BBC News.
Let's turn then to the football news. And Manchester United and Arsenal have both been in action in the last four of the Europa League, looking to make it to the final later this month in Poland. Our correspondent Katie Gornall was watching the games.
Manchester United in Rome, Arsenal at home. With an all-English Champions League final already set up, here was a chance to make it a full house for the Premier League in Europe. For Arsenal against Villarreal, the stakes couldn't be higher. A place in the Europa League final could save their season.
Aubameyang hits the post.
2-1 down from the first leg, every inch would have to be earned. Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang has endured a fraught season on and off the pitch. His dry spell in front of goal continued in the first half. This would be tense. Arsenal needed goals. The second half brought more urgency, but not accuracy, and time was running out. Aubameyang has delivered on this stage before. With 10 minutes left, could he do so again? Well, this was the painful answer. It was the best Arsenal could muster. While Villarreal celebrate their first European final, Arsenal are left to ponder how it all unravelled. After a turbulent week, Manchester United were sitting very comfortably in Rome. They started this game and Cristante cut United's cushion to 3 goals. After United equalised, Roma would go on to have the final say, scoring the 13th goal of this